Good afternoon and welcome to the special live broadcast of the IDC Dialogues. Whether it's road, rail or ports, the experts agree that bridging Africa's infrastructure gap is key to overcoming the continent's development challenges. But what exactly are the strategies needed to ultimately close this infrastructure gap? That's the big question we're focusing on today. And joining me in studio to share their insights are Ufekile Khumalo, who is Divisional Executive Agro and New Industries at the IDC, Dr. John Tambi, NEPAD Coordinator and Presidential Infrastructure Champion Initiative for the IDC, Paul Ranga, who is MD of Africa Project Access, and also joining us from our bureau in Lusaka is Dr. Freddie Kwesiga, who is Resident Representative of the African Development Bank in Zambia, and from our bureau in Nairobi, Sam Mambo, Director and Head of the Transportation Unit at the GIBB in Africa. Gentlemen, it's a big topic, and I'd like to start by perhaps trying to make it a bit more manageable by saying, what is the problem? In essence, there's clearly an historical infrastructure backlog in Africa. If Africa is to grow, it is growing, but if it's to grow and sustain through the decades ahead, it needs good infrastructure. So, John, perhaps I could ask you just to start off by saying, set the scene and in particular, the problem.
Thank you. It's very important, before we start talking about problems, to give you a genesis, to contextualize the infrastructure challenges of Africa. Africa is not lacking for not trying. Africa has tried before. From the 1970s, we had the Trans-Africa Highway. In the 80s and the 90s, we have African Action Plan. We have the new Partnership for Africa Development with the short-term action plan. Now we have PIDA, and we have the Presidential Infrastructure Champion Initiative. The question is, what is wrong with all these initiatives? What have we really accomplished? The problems are still the same. The challenges are still the same, but what has Africa not done right?
There's another one that you didn't mention, I think, was the railway, the Tanzania Railway, the Tazara Railway, as they used to call it, which was affected by the regional instability and so on. So, in a sense, what you're saying is, that is the problem. What has led to the problem not being solved?
Yes. First, we have to understand that when we talk about regional projects, we're talking about transboundary projects. It is very important to implement regional project when it's not a priority. There's the issue of ownership of this project. That is one. There's also the issue of harmonization of regulation and rules across boundaries. There's also the issue of financing this infrastructure project. And now we are talking about the private sector involvement in infrastructure development. But we have to be careful, because some of these infrastructure projects are perceived as public goods. So it's not very easy to get the private sector to just jump into it. We can discuss some of this as we continue this debate. Okay.
And also the private sector wants short-term or medium-term reward, and some of these projects, 20, 30 years is where we're going to talk. Ufekile, your perspective on, and perhaps to get into some of those issues, the cross-border issues, the funding issues, whether the private sector should be involved, harmonization, ownership.
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying that the challenges that Africa has got in terms of developing infrastructure are unique. I think even if you look at the developed economy, the developed countries themselves, they've never had these particular challenges. And one of the big challenges is the difficult geography that Africa finds itself in. We've got a lot of many small states, and you know, we have the distances from the countries to the ports is very long. You know, we have some rivers, for example, within Africa are not navigable. You know, as much as you want to do business, it's not possible for you to be competitive without that type of infrastructure. Now, there's been policy challenges, obviously, you know, over the years, but I'm glad to say that the trends are showing that there's a lot of improvements in terms of policy, and there's a lot of focus now in terms of getting the infrastructure, you know, on the road. The challenge that has been mentioned here of financing, it talks to the fact that we don't have developed financial sector within the rest of the continent. I think barring maybe South Africa and one or two other countries, the level of financial sophistication, you know, it's not there. That makes investing very, very, very difficult. And also, if you take the question that even amongst the coastlines, you know, the countries that are around the coast, we have very small coastlines, and we don't have very natural deep ports. So as a result, a lot of work needs to be done. Coming to the specific question that you mentioned, I mean, the fact that you've got many small states and the fact that you have to do business cross-border, it means that you have to pass borders, border control posts, you know, more than one in some cases. And given the fact that the population density is very small, this generally makes it very difficult. I mean, there are delays which can take more than 10 hours in a border post because of the poor infrastructure that you have on the road as well. Well,
I'll ask you to pause there,
yes.
and we just get a word from everyone. But I suppose what we'd like to do is prioritise some of these issues and
Absolutely.
see, if you like, what is the low-hanging fruit, what could be solved first. Your border post issue, that might be one where it's more of a bureaucratic thing than digging holes in the ground, which take a lot of work and funding. But Paul, from a business perspective, I know you can't speak for business, but in this little discussion, you do.
Yes. No, I'm coming, I'd like to put a bit of a different angle on things. I'm more micro-orientated than macro. We're dealing with specific projects and specific issues all day long. I've just returned from DRC and so on, and you see the problems and you see the advantages. And I'd like to say,
just give us the context of what kind of work you are doing.
What we do is we identify projects at the early stage, greenfields, brownfields phase for about 120 companies. So it means we have to be on the ground. I speak French and can help myself in Portuguese. And we are on the ground, and we just returned, for example, from DRC. Now the new copper belt, there are exponential growth points blossoming now all over Africa. Mtwara in Tanzania, Solwezi in the Northwest Province. Southern Angola has got huge potential. And there's a lot happening. And I can say that in the many years I've been dealing with this, I've never seen a project flow like today, and I've never seen a quality of project like today. It's true that a lot of it is resource driven. For example, the Nacala rail line that the Brazilians, Vale, are financing. We have new phenomena now. We have operator financed infrastructure. There are some dangers, however, that the government still have a major role, and the donor community, in bringing projects up to bankability. You know, private sector, for example, the big silver bullet that's mentioned a lot these days is public-private partnerships. There are many projects that are not PP-able, if I can use that word. So we have to, as business people, we want to make money unashamedly. And it's the role of the other players very much to bring the projects up to bankability, and then we will then carry it out. Very important, extremely important from our point of view as we tender for projects is the competence of the utilities, the roads agencies, the power utilities, and so on. There are many competent people in these utilities. I meet with them all the time, but there are not enough of them, and they're not empowered enough, and they're not paid enough.
All right, let's pause there. Utilities is an issue, and of course, there are mines, for example, in Africa where the operator pays. As you say, they go in, they build the infrastructure as well.
Correct.
So there are interesting variations on this. I just want to bring in the other couple of people in the discussion. Dr. Freddie Kwiziga, who is in Zambia. He's the African Development Bank representative there. Talking about funding, the word bank, that suggests he knows about this. So Freddie, perhaps you'd just like to give your perspective on some of these priorities that have been identified.
Yeah, thank you very much. The African Development Bank has prioritized the infrastructure development in Africa as one of the key areas of its intervention. It is very selective in what we do, and it's been a very big player on the African continent. As you know, we did 93 billion in terms of funding every year, of which half of that is coming from Africa itself. The other half needs to be made in gains and also in others contributing. But I think Africa has a challenge and also an opportunity. Somebody talked about the Tazama Railway. I remember there was also the Uganda Railway, which started from Mombasa and crossed all the way at the Rift Valley up to the slopes of Mount Rwenzori in 1956. This was one of the key areas of integration. And I think for Africa to really benefit from these economies of scale that a colleague talked about, regional integration is very key and very important. And infrastructure development, especially the railways, which are now very old, the roads, which are really not up to standard, but they are still moving. The ports you talked about, which are congested. You talked about energy and power, which we lack, even to develop agriculture and irrigation. We've seen some new trends of ICT and how they can reach the bottom rank of the ladder of our people. So there is both these challenges and opportunities. And in terms of funding, the African Development Bank has been helping our regional member countries in priority areas of infrastructure on all spheres. We started with building of schools and classrooms, building of hospitals, irrigation that we have been working on. I'll talk about specific examples in energy and roads, and also in ICT, and where we've been working in Africa, and up to the time of the PIDA, the Program for Infrastructure Development for Africa, that is now our new blueprint to look into the year 2040 on where infrastructure is going.
Okay, Freddie, if I could stop you there, and we move to Nairobi, where Sam Mambo, who is Director and Head of the Transportation Unit at the GIBB. Transport is mentioned there, Sam. Welcome to you. Your comments on particularly the transport infrastructure. I'll try again there, Sam. We seem to have a problem with the connection. Sam Mambo, Director and Head of the Transportation Unit of the GIBB in Africa. All right, we'll have to come back. We'll try and pick up Sam in a moment. You know, just listening to all of you talking, gentlemen, and listening to Freddie, there's no shortage of organisations, of acronyms, indeed even of funding organisations. So perhaps what we need to ask first is, you said you weren't doing the macro and you have hard micro experience there, Paul, but ownership. If a project has ownership and there's someone clearly going to drive it and is accountable for driving it and answers to various stakeholders, it's more likely to happen. Is there contestation? Are there delicacies? Are there sensitivities, John, about this? Who's actually going to drive it?
Before we go to ownership, I just want to say that Africa now has the solution to its infrastructure challenges through PIDA, the Program for Infrastructure Development for Africa. This is the continental framework that addresses all infrastructure sectors: ICT, energy, transport, and transboundary water. It is a continental project for the next 40 years, 30 years. We do have a priority action plan that speaks to ownership. Mm-hmm. See, this program for development was developed with the consensus of the RECs, the regional economic communities, the head of state, and the specialized African institutions like the power pools. What my colleague from the ADB was talking about the deficit, 45 billion was spent in Africa annually with domestic resources. So funding is not the issue. The issue is the preparation of the project for bankability. You see, that is the challenge. And that is being addressed by capacitating the RECs so that they have the capacity to prepare projects for bankability. All
right, let's come back to the word bankability. I think we've got Nairobi now, the connection there, and that's Sam Mambo, who is Director and Head of the Transportation Unit at the GIBB. Sam, good afternoon, and your comment particularly on transport infrastructure for your part of the discussion to get going?
Yes, I can hear you.
Your comments on the transport infrastructure in Africa and your perspectives on where they are now. There was talk of old railways and roads that aren't operating, ports, lots of heavy work to be done.
Yes, I think I have had some contributions. The sound was not very clear, but at least one thing I can share with you is that we do not seem to have had adequate capacity, particularly in the part of the world I come from, to implement infrastructure projects. Coupled with that, we find a lot of bureaucracy in procurement of both consultancy services and even contracting. To get a contractor on the ground, to get a consultant to do a design project takes a long, long time, whether it's a locally funded project or donor-funded project. Then we do have issues with capacity. We do not have adequate personnel to implement a lot of transport projects that we have, whether you talk of roads, airports, or even ports. If I can give an example of our country, Kenya, you find that over the last few years, over the last 9 years, a lot has been done to improve on capacity and implement projects because the government has the goodwill. This is now what I would say political will to implement projects, because I think the politicians must see that without good infrastructure, economic growth is just a mirage. One issue that perhaps has not been touched why we are lagging behind is corruption. We do have a lot of projects that have been implemented halfway. They have not benefited the communities because funds were exhausted before they were completed. A big factor sometimes is corruption, where we have sticky hands in some of these contracts, in some of these projects that we are trying to implement in Africa. Another issue that perhaps I would like to bring forward is poor quality control of implemented projects. A project, say a road project is open today, in less than, say, 2-3 years, it's full of potholes. It has failed. It is, the taxpayer does not get value for money. The government, the taxpayer has got to inject more funds, you know, to rehabilitate this road again, because there was no proper quality control. Some of this is tied to the issues I discussed earlier, that is corruption and the lack of perhaps capacity, qualified personnel to do all this.
Okay, but Sam, let's pause there and come back to our panel here, and perhaps Ufukile, you can talk there. Now, what's emerged here is this quite a firm comment: there's not shortage of money. There are funding institutions, there are presumably foreign institutions, I mean foreign to Africa, where there would be investment forthcoming if the project was right, and development aid and so on. So money not the problem, which is you know, a nice problem to have in a way. Yeah. What about this capacity, Ufukile, the capacity issue, which is another way of saying that quality control is needed, there isn't the capacity?
Yes, I think on the capacity issue, let me say that it talks to the model of project development and project implementation, because to build experience, to develop capacity effectively, you need to use the projects that are currently on the table as a test case for that type of capacity development. I think the new model must shift towards just implementing the project, but spend a bit of time upfront, you know, in terms of involving the communities, in terms of involving all the stakeholders, to ensure that once the project is off the ground, you can leave a legacy. I think in the past, what used to happen is that a project will come with maybe investors from overseas. They come in and the EPCM contractors, they build the project and they walk away. They leave nothing on the table. There could be other challenges that have been mentioned earlier on, but what is key is that to develop a project and to develop capacity, you need to have a real test case. So by design, when you're working on a project, you need to make sure that you are going to leave the legacy. So you can't leave that to chance as a government, as institutions.
Are there no examples of projects where a legacy has been left and lessons have been learned? And I'm going to come to Paul in a moment from the micro aspect of saying, what have you found works and what doesn't? But Ufukile, it isn't one long disaster story. There have been projects that have worked. Can one not learn from those where capacity has been installed and sustained?
Absolutely, and there are examples. I think there are few, but they are growing. I'll just give you an example of what we're trying to do in South Africa. You know, just as part of that lesson learned, what we're doing, we have our president, you know, in South Africa, we've set up a Presidential Infrastructure Coordination Commission. This commission is basically advocating an inclusive development model. We talk to municipalities, we talk to the mining towns, we talk to the mining companies, we talk to the investors, and all the other parties involved to make sure that once this project is implemented, right, there is capacity that is being left so that the next project that we implement, we're not starting from scratch. You see, that's the very critical aspect, that when you start the next project, you cannot start from zero again. So we need to build on that.
So surely part of the specifications for a project, if someone is tendering for it, bidding for it, part of it has to be that it will be the installation of capacity, training of the people in the area, or whatever is required. Paul, what's the experience on the ground? You said you represent, what, 120 companies? There's a lot of people who want to do business in Africa. What's your reaction to the capacity and the skills issue?
Well, firstly, let me just say that there is, with due respect to my colleagues, there are two major disconnects that are a problem. I'm talking about from a business point of view. Firstly, that the connection between business and government, we're not connecting like we should. We really are not. Secondly, I'd like to add another one, the gap between operators and financial people. We are passing one another by like ships in the night. And there's an absolute need to fuse those elements effectively together. I work with both, well, with all three. And I can see this disconnect. But I'm very upbeat because I'm running around the continent all the time. And let's refer to specific projects when we talk about, because you did make a reference like that. Maputo Corridor, which is long-standing, it was a success story. Why was it a success story? 3 governments bought into it. And there was the political will and there was the regional will to do it. Right now, Chirundu Port, we were talking about border posts. In the North-South corridor, we're trying to do one-stop border posts. Chirundu is far improved. I go to Kasumbaleza, however, and it's chaos still. It's far from being a one-stop border post. So I'm not dewy-eyed and overly optimistic, etc. I'm just a realist, and I'm saying that these things are happening. If you go to First Quantum or you go to Barrick operating in Solwezi, you can see they're rolling out 5,000 housing units in Solwezi within the next 6 months. So Nacala, the rail line has to happen, otherwise the coal can't move. So it's a very different story to before. We're really in a different ballgame now.
All right, well, what I want to do is to go to Nairobi and to Lusaka to talk about this government issue, the point that Paul has just made, the disconnect between governments and the operators and the finances. Let's try and be blunt about this. In Lusaka, the Zambian government, operators in Zambia, you're based there, Freddie. What's your reaction to that? Are they talking to each other?
Yeah, I think in Zambia, they have put infrastructure very, very seriously. They have created institutions, the Road Development Agency, for example, and they're trying to build its capacity to become a world-class institution. But there's still some time to go. They say a long way to go. The investors who come to put money, ourselves, the European Development Bank, the French, we're building with the Zambian government the Nakara corridor, the phase from the Ruangwa River up to Mwambi border post to put a one-stop border post. It's a project that is a regional project which goes through all the way to Malawi and Nakala. And the 3 governments are working very hard to try and overcome one issue, the issue of capacity and the issue of implementation. Yes, we have done long studies. We have contracted, several contractors are being looked at. But as a colleague said, at the level of government and at the level of implementation, we still have some issues. But we also understand.
Freddie, I'd like just to stop you there and get the comment from Sam in Nairobi. The Kenyan government and the players in this field, do they talk to each other? I can't hear Sam. I don't know if anyone else can. We seem to have lost that. Well, we'll try Sam again in Nairobi. But Paul, you're about to leave us. We're changing the panel slightly. So a good opportunity for you to elaborate. The interest is there, but the disconnect is there. What's the solution? Is it ego? We referred earlier to smaller countries and bigger countries where the smaller country doesn't want to be a kind of pushed around and told what's good for them. What's the problem?
Well, let's take a success story once again. The East African community. We have our fellow panelist in Kenya. I'm sure he'd make a contribution here. The East African community was revived with the 3 main countries, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, and now has included Rwanda and Burundi too. And if you see the East African power pool and the progress that's being made, it's quite substantial. Where it's not good is CMAC in Central Africa, where there are definite problems. So it's the RECs, or the regional economic communities, differ in competence and so on. But I'd like to say that on the back of the third boom, the third scramble for Africa, I go so far as to call it that, the other factor that must be injected into this conversation is, in order to from a business point of view, to succeed, we have to form consortia. We can't, even big companies have to work in groups. And it even means transnational consortia. We talk a lot about South Africa Inc., if we put on a South African hat, but we are talking to even the Chinese on various things. And there's a lot more. That's why I say it's not business as usual. We're forming consortia to get, we cannot throw enough CVs to tender for some of the projects. Even some of our bigger consulting engineering firms in South Africa can't do that. So we have collaboration, especially in consulting engineers, between South African consulting engineering firms, which is good. It's a very good development. I often say I don't care what they do in South Africa, because I'm based here and I don't cover South Africa, but across border, hold hands. And if you go to TET, 1 hour's flight from here, the whole United Nations is there. Jindal's just made a major investment, ENRC has. It's amazing what's going on now.
Well, we'll have to pause there. We come back in a moment, but goodbye to Paul Runge now from Africa Project Access. Going to a short break, more on bridging Africa's infrastructure gap when we return.